This is part 32 of ASP.NET Web API tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss attribute routing constraints. Let's look at an example now. Let's flip to Visual Studio. This is the same example that we worked with in our previous video. At the moment, we've got a method which returns student by ID. Now we want to include another method which is going to return a student by their name. So to this function, we are going to pass student name. And if we have any student with that name, then we want to return that specific student. So let's change the parameter name here to student. So just like ID, name is also a parameter. So let's give our solution a build, and here is what we want. In the URI, within the parameter segment, if I specify an integer, that is the ID of the student, then we want this URI /API/student/1 to be mapped to this method which has got an integer parameter. On the other hand, within the parameter segment, if I specify a string, that is the name of the student, then we want this URI /API/student/sam to be mapped to this method which has got string parameter. Let's see if that happens now. When we specify a string, we get an error. Multiple actions were found that match the request. Let's specify an integer instead of a string, and look at that, we get the same error. Why is this? This is because at the moment we've got two methods that are named get, and both of them have got a single parameter. So the framework is confused between which methods to use. We can very easily solve this problem by using routing constraints. And here is the syntax for using routing constraints: parameter : constraint. So here ID is a parameter, and we know this is going to be of type integer. Name is also a parameter, but this is of type alpha. Alpha stands for upper or lowercase alphabet characters. So if the parameter segment is an integer, then use this method. If it is alpha, that is upper or lowercase alphabets, then use this method. So let's give our solution a build, and when we specify an integer, we get that specific student as expected. Let's use student name instead of integer, and again notice we get that specific student as expected. So in addition to int and alpha constraints, we have several other constraints like double, float, decimal, boolean, etc. For the full list of available constraints, please check the MSDN documentation. And here is the example that we just looked at. At the moment, there is a small problem with this example. The string comparison is case sensitive. Let me explain what I mean. If I specify Sam with a lowercase s, look at that, we don't get any results back. That's because the string comparison right here is case sensitive. To make it case insensitive, let's convert name to lowercase. Let's do the same thing with the parameter as well. Let's give our solution a build and reload this page. Notice now the string comparison is not case sensitive anymore. Now let's discuss constraints with arguments. Some of the constraints like min, max, length, etc. take arguments. Let's look at an example. Now we know ID of student is a value greater than 0. Now if the ID value is greater than 0, only then we want a URI to be mapped to this method. So in the URI at the moment, if we specify a positive value like 1, we get that specific student as expected. If I specify 0, we don't have such a student, so we don't get anything back, but still this URI is mapped to this method, and we don't want that to happen. If someone specifies a value 0 or a negative value in the URI for ID parameter, then we don't want that URI to be mapped to this method. We want that URI to be mapped to this method only if ID value is greater than 0. We can very easily achieve that by using this min constraint, and here is the syntax for using min constraint. So we specify colon and then the constraint, and then within parentheses the value, the argument for that constraint. So we want this ID, which is of type integer, to have a minimum value of 1. Only then map that URI to this method. So let's give our solution a build, and let's specify the ID parameter value as -1. Look at that, we get an error. No HTTP resource was found that matches the request URI. So in this case, this URI /API/student/-1, this is not mapped to this method because we have specifically told map the URI to this method only if the ID value is greater than 0. Minimum value has to be 1. So if we pass again 0, we still should get the same error. And if I pass a positive number like 2, notice we get that specific student details is expected. Along with the min constraint, we can also use this max constraint. Let's understand this with an example. So here is what we want to do. We want this URI API/students/ID to be mapped to this method only if the value is between 1 and 3. So 1 is the minimum value and the maximum value is going to be 3. So here we are specifying both min and max constraints. Let's give our solution a build, and if we specify a value between 1 and 3, we get that specific student as expected. But if I specify a value outside of that range, notice we get the error, no HTTP resource was found that matches the request URI. At the moment, to enforce a range for this ID parameter value, we are using two constraints, min and max. Minimum value is 1 and the maximum value is 3. We can achieve exactly the same thing just by using this range constraint right here. And here is the syntax for that. Range, and then within the parentheses we specify the minimum and maximum range. So let's use range constraint instead of min and max. So with our range constraint, the minimum value is going to be 1 and the maximum value is going to be 3. So if the ID parameter value is outside the range, we get an error. If it is within the range, then we get that specific student as expected. Here's an example of using constraint with arguments. Thank you for listening and have a great day.